All right, everybody, we are going to talk about the modes today, and we're really just going to go through the specifics of sort of what we want to take away from these. As we've talked about, modes come with a lot of different ways of using them, ways of thinking of them, and we're obviously not going to be able to cover every single way that you might approach a mode. Instead, want to talk about one specific way to look at them. And so that's part of what we want to do today. Some people may actually be coming into this with a little bit of knowledge about the modes, and particularly if you have some knowledge from maybe like a jazz background, something like that. We may need to adjust just a little bit of how we think about it. But what I want to really stress with this is it's not about changing the way we think about something. I'm really viewing this as my role here is to introduce a new way of interpreting, understanding, conceptualizing, and eventually using this topic. So let's get into it and see what we can come up with for the modes. All right. So here we go. So modes. That word, means a lot of different things. We're really just talking about the diatonic modes of the major scale. So we're taking the major scale, we're starting on different notes, making new scales out of it, but they're always coming from that same original source, the major scale. So this is the first step here for us in kind of bridging this gap here. We have to think about that there are really two different ways that people sometimes talk about or understand the modes. And the first is what I would call the key signature approach, which is to say what accidentals are there, right? And so in this, you'll hear people always relating the mode or a scale to a different major or minor key, and by just sort of changing the key signature. So you might hear people say something like, "Oh, it's A minor with B flat," like it's or it's F major starting on the third scale degree, right? And so we're sort of thinking about a key signature that we're familiar with, and it's always coming back to that. So that's the example that I just gave. So we would say A Phrygian, which we'll get to in a second, has the same notes as F major. So in this, you're sort of always relating an A scale based on A, to a scale based on F. In the same way, you could say something like, oh, okay, so we'll say C Lydian is the same notes as G major. You see how we have to do this sort of comparison type of thing? And that's an interesting way of thinking about the key signature method. The second method is to think about parallel scales. So instead of thinking, like in the top example, about comparing A Phrygian to F major, in the parallel scales model, we would be trying to use the same tonic note all the time. So in this example, we would compare D Lydian to D major. So both of these ways of conceptualizing things are going to involve needing to sort of take a familiar starting point and making an adjustment to it. But the parallel scales model keeps the same tonic, D. We're always thinking about a scale based around D here. Or we could do the same thing for the top example. Instead of trying to compare A Phrygian to F major, we would be saying, how does A Phrygian compare to either A major or A minor, right? So that's the big distinction here. I find that the key signature approach, as I'm calling it, does tend to be a little bit more widely used in a jazz circle. And that's because oftentimes we're using the modes in jazz to play over different chords. And a lot of the time, that's sort of in the service of like a 2-5-1 in any key where you're kind of quickly adjusting where you need to go. The parallel scales approach is the one that we're going to use mostly in this class because it gives us a little bit of a longer term connection with staying in that mode. And it allows us to sort of construct a larger or conceptualize a larger musical statement in one single mode. So that's the one that we are going to prioritize, the parallel scales model. And it's not to say that if you've learned about the modes in a key signature way that that's bad or anything. No, use that to help you build on so that you can even deepen your knowledge here. But the one that we're going to prioritize here is the parallel scales model. And I sort of hinted at this a little bit, but in this parallel scales model, we're going to make sort of a big division between the modes. And some of them we're going to relate to the major scale, where others we're going to relate a little bit more closely to the minor scale. So we really just have sort of two main starting points, major or minor, whereas with the key signature approach, we're always comparing it to a different major scale. I think it gets a little bit cumbersome there. So let's get into this here a little bit. So when we talk about the modes, we really traditionally, we would say that there are 7 modes, because the basic construct here is we take a major scale and you start on a different note. So here's starting on the first note. What if I started on the second note of the major scale and just played a scale with exactly those same notes? Right? I can make new scales. And so, since there are 7 notes in each major scale, it would be really easy to be like, oh, well, then there are 7 modes, which is true. However, there's a nice bonus in there, which is that 2 of these are already scales that we're really, really, really familiar with. So if we're saying that to build a mode, we're taking the notes of the major scale and starting on the different notes. Well, if you start on the very first note of a major scale, I think we already know that scale, right? It's the major scale. But because modes don't want to leave anybody out, we do get to give the major scale a fancy modal name, which is, we call it Ionian. All the modes have these sort of Greek-sounding names. Ionian is the mode name for the major scale. And we can chat about this a little bit too, but it's a little debatable thing whether or not we really want to consider major a mode, because one of the big reasons we're talking about the modes is because they can give us a very distinct and different sound. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to take a major scale and make it sound drastically different, right? What do you think would be the other scale that we already really know about out of this? So if I just start with the same exact notes as major, so if we look here, we've got C major. What other scale do we know that I could just start at one of these other notes and have a scale we are super familiar with already? Well, what if I started on A? Right, the natural minor scale. But of course, because this is modal, we get to give it a fun, exciting name. And so we call that the Aeolian mode. So Ionian is major, just a straight up major scale. Aeolian with an A-E-O vowel pattern there, which is pretty cool. Aeolian is the natural minor scale. So again, these two, we have done a lot of work with the major scale and the natural minor scale, super familiar. And so these are not ones that we're going to focus on too much here. They are modes, right? We took the major scale and we made scales out of it. That's a mode. So Aeolian, even though we learned about the natural minor scale in Theory 1, that's still a mode. That it doesn't lose its modal status. But we don't really need to sort of spend a lot of time really digging down on that. The major scale, we have so many connections with it being used widely. It doesn't really feel modal in the way that these other scales will. And Aeolian, we get a little bit more of a connection with that because we know that, think about the way that we use the harmonic minor, the melodic minor constructs. We've done a lot to adjust minor in the way we use it that kind of gives it a really specific sound. And so if we avoid those things, if we don't raise the leading tone in particular, we can make Aeolian, we can make natural minor still feel like a minor scale, or a mode. But the others that we're left with here, these are the ones that have a much more distinct difference from what the tonal centers, the tonal world that we've been using. So let's talk about these specifically. And the first is going to be called Dorian, the Dorian mode. And this one is the first of what we're going to consider the minor modes. And all I mean by that is that it's closer to minor than it's closer to a natural minor scale than it is to a major scale. And so when we're thinking about it, when we're conceptualizing this scale, we want to take the minor on any given tonic and make the adjustment from there to get Dorian. So let's sort of get an example there. So this is the C Dorian scale. So what we want to look at here, first of all, I hope you like that sound. Dorian has this just lovely, lovely sound to it. Can we notice what the difference is between C Dorian and C natural minor? It's that sixth scale degree. So if I play C natural minor, we've got lay, do, re, mi, fa, sol, lay, right? Dorian has la, has a really bright raised sixth. So if we were trying to compare Dorian with the natural minor, we would say Dorian is minor with a raised sixth, right? La instead of lay. Really, really, really big difference. That tiny half step in the color. I mean, so if you're in minor, natural minor, lay, it's such a dark, really lovely sound. La for Dorian, that really, really cool sound. So we want to think about how it relates to the natural minor scale. And then it's just that one tiny little note difference. Some people find it really helpful, especially I think when you're getting started with modes, to think about how they would be built just using the white keys. And so Dorian, very famously, is white keys D to D. Right, so if you just start on the note D and you use all natural notes, you get a D Dorian scale. And so what happens is you have B natural instead of B flat, which would be lay, sol, fa, mi, re, do, right? So that's Dorian. Moving on. Oh, I should have also said, this note here, the la versus lay thing, the term we use for that is it's the mode's color tone. That is the note that gives Dorian its color, its specific, unique color, especially compared to its parallel minor or major. So when we compare C Dorian to C natural minor, it's the A natural, it's la, the raised sixth, that gives Dorian its color. And so we call that its color tone. Let's do the next one. Let's do Phrygian next. This is the one that's the most useful, especially if you are looking to integrate like a new curse word into your vocabulary. Phrygian. All right, it's kind of perfect for that. So let's talk about Phrygian. If we were comparing this to the major scale, which we're not really trying to do, but it would be starting on the third degree and going from there. So let's do an A Phrygian scale, and just there's such a great color here. And I think you can hear right at the bottom of this scale. I'm going to play it down an octave. There's such an amazing color there, and I hope we can see that if we were comparing A Phrygian to A natural minor, the note that should really jump out is that B flat, right? We've got a half step above tonic. If we were thinking about solfege, we would be saying do, ra, do, right? Which is really awesome. So A natural minor with the B natural. Right? Me, re, do. But if we do Phrygian, me, ra, do, it has such a gravity down to tonic. Really, really amazing. And I think just Phrygian has this amazing window into what we're talking about with this idea of the color tone, which is that just that one tiny half-step change can make such a world of difference. As we go along, we're going to find that this is especially true if we add like chords to what we're doing. So if we're here, I mean, Phrygian has such a different sound, such a different color than even natural minor. Oh my goodness. I played a seventh chord by accident. Right? Do, re, do versus do, ra, do. Man, so different. So Phrygian, if we're comparing it to the natural minor, because again, it's one of the minor or darker modes, it's got a flat 2. So we would say the color tone in Phrygian is Ra, is the lowered second scale degree. All right. Let's get a little different here. Let's talk Lydian. Lydian is one of the bright or major modes. So here's D Lydian. Do we hear the note, or can we see the note that stands out there? I hope you're noticing that in D major we would not have a G sharp. So the raised fourth is majorly the color tone of Lydian. And we think of it as the brightest of all the modes. You can hear ba 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 ba, right? That's really, really got that brightness to it. A lot of light in here. And we've got these two really interestingly placed half steps. We've got Fi, Sol. But also, in Lydian, we have a traditional leading tone. T, Do, C sharp up to D. And Lydian is the only mode outside of Ionian, which we remember is code for major, to have that traditional leading tone. And that's part of what gives Lydian its brightness, is we've got that leading tone up top, sort of really securely sort of placing us at tonic, with the added brightness of Fi, Sol, right? So that feature is really critical, and it gives us this extra sort of element which it becomes very important for Lydian, and we'll compare this with something else down the line. We've got this group of whole steps right at the bottom of the scale. Do, re, mi, fi. The first four notes, that first half of the scale, are all whole steps, which is part of what gives it that real open brightness. Real unique. And of course, if we compare that to D major, right? Do, re, mi, fa, do, re, mi, fi. Again, such a difference in sound between major, do, re, mi, fa, sol, versus Lydian, do, re, mi, fi, sol. Really kind of amazing. So the color tone in Lydian is the raised fourth. It's Phi, right? Raised fourth is the Lydian color tone. All right. We're making it here, people. Let's talk now. We just did Lydian. What about Mixolydian? You gotta love the names of these at the very least. So Mixolydian. So Mixolydian probably gets the distinction as being the most common of the modes for us to just sort of hear in our daily lives. You know, anytime you hear like that kind of thing, that's in the Mixolydian mode, which is kind of fun. So what is Mixolydian? Let's be in B flat Mixolydian here. Anybody notice which of the notes is different from major? Well, I hope you notice that we have A flat here. So this is basically the major scale, a B flat major scale, except instead of having T do, we've got Te do, right? So the color tone in Mixolydian is the flat 7. And that's what really, really makes it sound different. So major, you would have this, right? That's our very, very, very typical major 1, 5, 1, do, ti, do kind of thing. In Mixolydian. See how it's like, what is that? We typically would harmonize that. Mixolydian, right? Very, very different sound. So flat 7 is the color tone in Mixolydian. It's major scale, just no leading tone, okay? And this, of course, as you can see here, because it's related to the major scale, with just that one difference, we would consider Mixolydian one of the bright or major modes. All right, let's look at one last mode here, which is the Locrian mode. Oh, Locrian. Now, you may not be super familiar with Locrian, and I'm about to show you why. So we often think about Locrian as kind of a theoretical mode. Doesn't get super widely used. So here's E Locrian. Which just is not great. And so if we think about why Locrian is less good, usually, I try to not just call things out like this, but with Locrian, you just have to. One of the major issues that Locrian has is that it contains a diminished tonic chord. So E, G, B flat. So the other modes, we haven't talked about this in this video, but the other modes, you can really resolve to tonic, and if you were using triads with them, you can give it that sense of closure, sense of resolution. Locrian, it's really hard to do that because it's all based on a diminished chord. So if I was sort of bopping around, that's not a very satisfying musical ending because of the diminished tonic triad. The other thing that's really, really unique about Locrian is that it's the only one of these modes that's more than one note different from the major or the minor scale. So I'm comparing it here with E natural minor. Right? And so we've got, instead of do, re, mi, we've got in Locrian do, ra, mi, do, ra, mi. And instead of sol, do, re, mi, fa, sol, we've got do, ra, mi, fa, se. It's all kinds of trouble. So we're not going to do almost anything with Locrian because it's not super useful and it's got major issues. So just want to introduce it here. And of course, it's a nice little segue to one of the great memes. All modes are beautiful, not you, and deserve to be used. Of course, with old friend of no one, Locrian, right in the middle. So that's just a little look at modes here so that you can reference this, remember how they're all built, but we're going to keep on working with these.